Have you ever been so humiliated, so completely torn apart in front of people you thought you could trust, that you felt something inside you fundamentally shift? That moment when embarrassment transforms into something else entirely, something powerful and unstoppable? Well, let me tell you what happened to me. Because what started as the worst Friday afternoon of my entire life became the catalyst for a Monday morning that nobody in that office would ever forget. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how I went from being the laughingstock of Richardson Tech Solutions to becoming the person who exposed the truth that had been hiding in plain sight for over 2 years. I need you to understand something right from the start. This wasn't about revenge. Not really. Even though that's what everyone assumed afterward. This was about dignity. This was about standing up when everyone expected me to stay down. This was about proving that the quiet person in the corner, the one they all underestimated and dismissed, could be the most dangerous person in the room when pushed too far. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to that Friday, to the conference room on the 3rd floor where my entire world came crashing down in the most public and devastating way possible. The fluorescent lights were buzzing overhead like they always did, casting that harsh, unforgiving glow that made everyone look slightly sickly. I remember thinking how appropriate that was, how the lighting matched the toxic atmosphere that had been building in that office for months. I walked into that conference room at 2:15 in the afternoon, carrying my laptop and a folder full of the quarterly reports I'd spent 3 weeks preparing. My heart was racing, not from nervousness about the presentation. I knew my work was solid, but from something else, a strange premonition that something was about to go terribly wrong. You know that feeling when your body knows something your mind hasn't figured out yet? That was me, walking toward a disaster I couldn't see but could somehow sense. The room was already full. Marcus Henderson, our department head, sat at the head of the table with that smug expression he always wore, like he was perpetually amused by some private joke the rest of us weren't intelligent enough to understand. To his right sat Jennifer Caldwell, the golden girl of our department, the one who could do no wrong in Marcus's eyes despite the fact that she spent more time networking at expensive lunches than actually working. Then there was David Chen, Tom Bradley, and Rebecca Morrison, all of them already settled in their chairs, already exchanging those knowing glances that made my stomach twist into knots. I should have known something was wrong when I noticed the extra people in the room, executives from upstairs who never attended our regular department meetings. But I was focused on my presentation, on making sure I didn't stumble over my words or forget any crucial data points. I connected my laptop to the projector, pulled up my carefully prepared slides, and took a deep breath. That's when Jennifer spoke up, her voice dripping with false sweetness that made my skin crawl. She said, "And I'll never forget these exact words because they're burned into my memory like a brand," she said. "Oh, Sarah's presenting today? I hope everyone brought their coffee. We're going to need it to stay awake through another one of her thrilling spreadsheet deep dives." The room erupted in laughter. Not polite chuckles or uncomfortable titters, but genuine, mean-spirited laughter that echoed off the walls and slammed into me like physical blows. I felt my face flush hot, felt that familiar burning sensation behind my eyes that meant tears were threatening to come, but I forced them back. I forced myself to smile, to pretend like I was in on the joke, like it didn't hurt. That's what I always did, wasn't it? I made myself small, made myself agreeable, swallowed every insult and slight because I thought that's what you had to do to survive in a corporate environment. I thought if I just kept my head down and did good work, eventually people would respect me. God, I was naive. Marcus didn't defend me, didn't tell Jennifer her comment was inappropriate. Instead, he grinned and said, Now, Jennifer. I'm sure Sarah has some fascinating pie charts to share with us today." More laughter, and this time I caught Tom actually wiping tears from his eyes like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. Something inside me cracked in that moment, but I pushed forward with my presentation anyway. What else could I do? I started talking about quarterly earnings and departmental efficiency metrics, but nobody was listening. Jennifer was typing on her phone, not even bothering to hide it. David and Tom were having a whispered conversation, periodically glancing at me and smirking. Rebecca looked uncomfortable, but said nothing, did nothing to intervene. The executives from upstairs seemed confused by the hostile atmosphere but didn't address it. And Marcus just sat there with that insufferable expression, occasionally nodding like he was paying attention but clearly thinking about something else entirely. I got through maybe 15 minutes of my 30-minute presentation before Marcus interrupted me. He held up his hand and said, "Okay, Sarah, I think we've got the general idea here. Let's move on to other business. We're running behind schedule." I stood there, frozen, my laser pointer still aimed at the screen showing a graph I'd spent hours perfecting. But I haven't covered the third and fourth quarter projections yet, I managed to say, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. Those are the most important sections. Marcus waved his hand dismissively. We can review those in the written report. No need to waste everyone's time going through every single detail. Waste everyone's time. That's what my work was to him. A waste of time. 3 weeks of research, analysis, late nights in the office, double-checking every figure, every calculation, and it was all just a waste of time. I disconnected my laptop with shaking hands and returned to my seat at the far end of the table. The seat that was somehow always left for me no matter how early I arrived. The seat that was as far from the center of power as possible while still technically being in the room. The meeting continued without me, as if I'd never been there at all. They discussed Jennifer's proposal for a new client outreach program, a proposal that was essentially identical to one I'd submitted 6 months earlier that had been rejected without discussion. They congratulated David on closing a major deal, even though I'd done at least 40% of the groundwork for that deal and received zero acknowledgement. They talked about upcoming projects and assignments, and I watched as all the interesting high-visibility work was distributed among the same small group of people, while I was assigned yet another data consolidation project, which was code for tedious grunt work that nobody else wanted to do. Have you ever felt invisible? Not metaphorically invisible, but genuinely unseen? Like you could stand up and scream and nobody would even register that you'd made a sound? That's what it felt like sitting in that conference room, watching my colleagues divide up opportunities and accolades while I sat in my designated corner, forgotten and dismissed. But here's the thing about being invisible. People forget you're watching. They forget you're listening. And they get careless about what they say and do right in front of you. The meeting dragged on for another hour. And during that time, I observed something I'd been noticing for weeks but hadn't fully processed until that moment. There was a rhythm to how Marcus ran these meetings, a pattern to how he distributed assignments and praise, and it had nothing to do with actual performance or capability. Jennifer got the premium assignments not because she was particularly skilled, but because she laughed at Marcus's jokes and regularly invited him to those networking lunches I mentioned earlier. David got recognition for work that multiple people contributed to because he was in Marcus's fantasy football league, and they'd bonded over their shared obsession with statistics and predictions. Tom got away with cutting corners and missing deadlines because he went drinking with Marcus every other Thursday at some upscale bar downtown where they apparently discussed everything from office politics to their personal lives. The pattern was so obvious once I allowed myself to see it clearly. This wasn't a meritocracy. This was a social club, and I'd never been invited to join. But it was more than just favoritism and cliquish behavior. There was something else happening. Something I'd picked up on in fragments and overheard conversations but hadn't pieced together until I was sitting there in that conference room, invisible and ignored, with nothing to do but watch and listen. Marcus kept making references to a project he called the Meridian Initiative, speaking about it in vague terms that suggested it was something significant, something important. Jennifer nodded knowingly whenever he mentioned it, and David made a comment about the timeline accelerating, which Marcus acknowledged with a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'd heard the name Meridian before, seen it pop up in a few email subject lines that I wasn't included on, but I'd assumed it was just another corporate buzzword for some internal restructuring or efficiency program. Companies loved their coded project names, their secret initiatives that made middle managers feel like they were involved in something special and exclusive. But watching the way Marcus and his inner circle discussed Meridian, seeing the glances they exchanged and the careful way they worded their comments despite the fact that we were supposedly all on the same team in that conference room, I realized there was something genuinely secretive about this project, something they were actively hiding from people like me and Rebecca, and the handful of other employees who existed on the periphery of the department's power structure. When the meeting finally ended, I gathered my things quickly, desperate to escape before anyone could make another cutting remark or dismissive joke at my expense. But as I stood up, I heard Jennifer say to Marcus, just loudly enough for me to hear, and I think that was intentional. I don't understand why we keep her around. What does she even do besides make graphs nobody reads? Marcus's response was quieter, but the conference room acoustics carried his voice directly to where I stood. She's harmless, he said, and she does all the boring administrative work nobody else wants to touch. Why pay someone else to do it when she's already here? Harmless. That word echoed in my head as I walked out of that conference room, down the hallway, past the cubicles where people were wrapping up their work for the day and making plans for the weekend. Harmless. Like I was some benign presence, some piece of office furniture that served a function but didn't merit any real consideration or respect. I made it to my car in the parking garage before the tears finally came, hot and angry and full of years of accumulated frustration and hurt. I sat there behind the wheel, mascara running down my face, and I made a decision. I decided I was done being harmless, done being invisible, done accepting scraps and insults and dismissal. But more than that, I decided I was going to find out exactly what the Meridian Initiative was, because something in my gut told me it was important, told me it was the key to understanding the deeper rot in our department. And maybe, just maybe, it was also the key to making sure that Monday morning, everyone in that office would remember my name. I didn't go straight home that Friday evening. Instead, I drove around for a while, letting the tears dry on my face and trying to organize the chaos of emotions swirling inside me. Humiliation was there, sharp and fresh from the afternoon's events. Anger simmered underneath, anger at Marcus and Jennifer and the entire toxic culture they'd created. But beneath even that, there was something else emerging, a cold, clear sense of determination I hadn't felt in years. I'd spent 5 years at Richardson Tech Solutions, 5 years steadily moving backward in terms of respect and opportunity. 5 years watching less qualified people leapfrog over me because they knew how to play the political game and I didn't. Or maybe it was because I refused to play, refused to compromise my integrity by sucking up to managers who didn't deserve respect, or by throwing colleagues under the bus to make myself look better. I'd always believed that hard work and competence would speak for themselves, but in an environment like ours, those qualities just made you useful, not valued. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that what happened in that conference room wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of 5 years of microaggressions and subtle discrimination, 5 years of being passed over and talked down to and dismissed. Every time Marcus had interrupted me in meetings to let someone else speak, every time Jennifer had taken credit for work I'd contributed to, every time I'd been assigned the grunt work while watching others coast on minimal effort, every time I'd heard whispered conversations go silent when I approached, or caught people exchanging meaningful looks that I wasn't meant to understand, it all added up to a pattern of deliberate marginalization, and I'd enabled it by staying quiet, by not making waves, by convincing myself that things would eventually get better if I just worked harder and waited patiently for my turn. Well, my turn was never going to come. Not in that environment, not under Marcus's leadership. If I wanted things to change, I was going to have to force the change myself. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, I'd made a plan, or at least the beginning of one. I was going to find out what the Meridian Initiative was, and I was going to document every piece of evidence I could find about the favoritism and unprofessional behavior that had become standard operating procedure in our department. I didn't know exactly what I'd do with that information yet, but I knew that knowledge was power, and I'd been powerless for far too long. That weekend, I barely left my apartment. I ordered takeout, ignored calls from my mom asking about my week, and dove deep into research mode. I started by reviewing every email I'd received in the past year, searching for any mention of Meridian. There were surprisingly few, which told me that most of the communication about this project was happening through channels I didn't have access to. But I did find a few threads where Marcus had accidentally included me on emails, probably because he'd used a department-wide distribution list without thinking about it. The emails were frustratingly vague, talking about Phase 2 implementation and securing the necessary approvals and maintaining discretion until we're ready to announce. One email from Jennifer to Marcus, sent late at night about 3 months earlier, mentioned concerns about the ethical implications, but then immediately followed up with, "But I trust your judgment on how to handle this." Ethical implications. That phrase caught my attention and wouldn't let go. I pulled up our company's organizational chart and started mapping out the relationships between people, drawing connections between Marcus and his inner circle, and trying to identify who else might be involved in Meridian. I noticed that several people from the finance department had been having regular meetings with Marcus, which was unusual because our departments typically only interacted during quarterly reviews. I also noticed that Marcus had been traveling more frequently in the past 6 months, trips that weren't reflected in our department calendar or his publicly visible schedule. There was a shadow structure operating alongside the official company hierarchy, and Meridian was at its center. Saturday afternoon, I did something I'd never done before. I created a new email account, completely separate from my work account, and I started documenting everything I could remember about the toxic workplace environment at Richardson Tech. Every instance of favoritism, every inappropriate comment, every time someone's work had been credited to someone else. I wrote it all down in meticulous detail, including dates and times and witnesses where possible. It was therapeutic in a way, getting it all out of my head and onto paper, or onto the screen at least. But it was also enraging because seeing it all laid out like that, seeing the pattern so clearly documented, made it impossible to minimize or excuse anymore. This wasn't just office politics or personality conflicts. This was systematic discrimination and harassment, and it had been going on for years. By Sunday evening, I had a 30-page document detailing incidents going back 3 years, as far as my memory could reliably take me. I also had a list of questions about Meridian that needed answers. What was the project actually about? Why was it being kept secret from most of the department? What were the ethical implications Jennifer had mentioned? Who outside of our department knew about it? And most importantly, was there something genuinely wrong happening here? Or was I just paranoid and desperate to find a smoking gun that didn't exist? I needed more information, and I knew there was only one way to get it. I was going to have to access files and communications that I wasn't authorized to see. Now, before you judge me, understand that I'm not a rule breaker by nature. I've always been the person who follows procedures, who respects boundaries, who colors inside the lines, but I'd also reached a point where I realized the system wasn't designed to protect people like me, it was designed to protect people like Marcus. If I went through official channels, filed complaints with HR, raised concerns about projects I wasn't supposed to know about, I'd be dismissed as a disgruntled employee making trouble. I'd probably be fired within a week, and nothing would change. The only way to effect real change was to gather irrefutable evidence, and that meant bending some rules. So Sunday night, I made another decision that would have been unthinkable to me just a few days earlier. I decided that Monday morning, I was going to start my own investigation, and I wasn't going to let little things like access permissions or authorization levels stop me. Here's something most people don't know about me. Before I ended up in corporate data analysis, I studied computer science in college. I was actually pretty good at it, good enough that I'd considered going into cybersecurity or systems administration. But life had other plans. I needed a job quickly after graduation to pay off student loans, and I ended up in business analytics instead. Over the years, I'd gotten comfortable in that role and let my technical skills atrophy, but the knowledge was still there, buried under years of Excel spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations. I spent Sunday night refreshing my memory on network security basics, on how corporate file systems were typically structured, on the kinds of vulnerabilities that often existed in company networks because IT departments prioritized convenience over security. I wasn't planning anything illegal, not really. I was just planning to look at files that I technically had network access to, but wasn't supposed to actively seek out. There's a difference, even if it's a subtle one. Monday morning arrived, and I woke up at 5 a.m. with a mixture of anticipation and dread churning in my stomach. I showered, dressed in my usual work clothes, made coffee that I barely tasted, and drove to the office through dawn light that seemed somehow more vivid than usual, like the world was sharper and more real than it had been just days before. I arrived at the office at 6:30, earlier than my usual time, but not so early that it would seem suspicious. The building was mostly empty at that hour, just a few dedicated souls in other departments and the night shift security guard who nodded at me as I badged through the entrance. I went to my desk, turned on my computer, and pulled up my regular work files to establish a baseline of normal activity. Then, once my presence in the system was logged and established, I started exploring. Corporate networks are interesting things, layers upon layers of access controls and security measures, but there are always gaps, always places where convenience trumps security. Shared drives that have overly broad access permissions, distribution lists that include people who shouldn't really be on them, file naming conventions that make sensitive documents easy to identify if you know what to look for. I started with the shared drives, navigating through folder structures and looking for anything labeled or related to Meridian. It took almost an hour of careful searching, during which time I kept one eye on the hallway and one ear listening for footsteps. But eventually I found it. A folder buried 3 levels deep in the finance department's shared drive, labeled simply M Initiative Confidential. My heart rate spiked as I clicked on it, half expecting to be denied access, but the folder opened. Someone, probably some overworked IT administrator, had given broad access permissions to the entire finance shared drive instead of locking down individual folders. It was a common mistake, one that IT security specialists warned about constantly, and one that I was now deeply grateful for. Inside the folder were dozens of documents, spreadsheets tracking financial transactions, PowerPoint presentations outlining project phases, email chains discussing implementation strategies, Word documents containing what looked like legal analyses of various scenarios. I didn't have time to read everything in detail, not while sitting at my desk where anyone could walk by and see what I was looking at, so I did something else that would have been unthinkable to me a week earlier. I copied everything to a thumb drive I'd brought from home. A thumb drive I'd carefully wiped clean the night before. The file transfer took 8 minutes. 8 minutes during which I barely breathed. 8 minutes during which every sound in the office made me jump. But finally, it was done. I had the files. I ejected the thumb drive, slipped it into my pocket, and closed out of the shared drive folder. Then I spent the next hour actually doing my assigned work, making it look like I'd been productively busy since I arrived, creating a cover story in case anyone checked my activity logs later. By 8 a.m., people were starting to trickle into the office, greeting each other with that Monday morning exhaustion everyone shares, heading to the break room for coffee and small talk about their weekends. I joined them, played my part, smiled and nodded, and made appropriate small talk about nothing important. Jennifer arrived around 8:30, looking annoyingly refreshed and energetic, immediately launching into a story about some exclusive brunch spot she'd discovered over the weekend. Marcus rolled in at 9, later than usual, looking slightly haggard in a way that suggested his weekend hadn't been as relaxing as he'd hoped. The morning passed in its usual rhythm of emails and meetings and mundane tasks, but I was operating on 2 levels simultaneously. On the surface, I was regular Sarah, harmless Sarah, invisible Sarah doing her boring spreadsheet work and staying out of everyone's way. But underneath, I was something else entirely. I was someone with a thumb drive full of secrets in my pocket and a plan forming in my mind. Someone who'd crossed a line over the weekend and couldn't go back even if she wanted to. During my lunch break, I didn't go to the cafeteria like usual. Instead, I walked to a coffee shop 3 blocks away, ordered a drink I didn't want, and sat in the corner with my personal laptop, the one that had no connection to the company network. I plugged in the thumb drive and started reading through the files I'd copied that morning. What I found made my blood run cold. The Meridian Initiative wasn't just some corporate restructuring or efficiency program. It was a systematic scheme to overbill clients, to inflate project costs and pocket the difference, to manipulate financial records to hide the fraud. And it wasn't small scale. We were talking about millions of dollars over the course of the past 18 months. Millions of dollars that had been funneled through fake vendors and inflated expense reports, and carefully constructed accounting tricks that made everything look legitimate on the surface. Marcus was at the center of it, but he wasn't alone. Jennifer was involved, as were David and Tom. Several people from finance were complicit, helping to structure the transactions in ways that would pass cursory audits. Even some executives from upstairs, the ones who'd been in that conference room on Friday, were implicated in the email chains I was reading. This was big, bigger than I'd imagined, bigger than workplace favoritism or toxic management. This was actual criminal fraud, the kind of thing that destroyed companies and sent people to prison. I sat in that coffee shop, staring at my laptop screen, and I felt a wave of emotions crash over me. Vindication, because I'd been right that something was fundamentally wrong in our department. Fear, because I now possessed information that powerful people would do almost anything to keep hidden. Excitement, a dark thrill at holding this power, at knowing I could bring down the entire edifice of corruption that had made my work life miserable for years. And underneath it all, a bone-deep certainty that I'd stumbled into something that was going to change everything, not just for me, but for everyone at Richardson Tech Solutions. I spent 2 hours in that coffee shop, reading through every document, taking notes, beginning to understand the full scope of what Marcus and his accomplices had created. They'd been careful. I had to give them that. The scheme was sophisticated, layered with enough legitimate business activity to provide plausible deniability if anyone started asking questions. But they'd also gotten greedy, and greedy people make mistakes. They'd kept detailed records because they needed to track the money flow and coordinate the various moving parts of their operation. Those detailed records were now sitting on my laptop, copied from a shared drive they'd assumed was secure, and I was the person who'd found them. The question now was what to do with this information. I could take it to HR, but HR's primary loyalty was to the company, not to individual employees, and they might just sweep everything under the rug to avoid the scandal and legal liability. I could go to the police, but I didn't know enough about white-collar crime investigation to know if I had enough evidence for them to take action. I could take it to the media, but that felt like nuclear option, one that might damage innocent people along with the guilty ones. Or I could do something else, something that had been forming in my mind since I first started reading through these files. I could confront Marcus directly, could make it clear that I knew everything and that he had a choice. He could come clean and face the consequences, or I could make sure the information went public in the most damaging way possible. It was a risky strategy, one that could blow up in my face spectacularly, but it also gave me a certain amount of control over how this situation unfolded. I returned to the office after lunch with a plan crystallizing in my mind. I spent the afternoon working normally, or as normally as I could manage given that I was sitting on information that could destroy half the management structure of our company. I watched Marcus hold court in his office, watched Jennifer prance around like she owned the place, watched David and Tom joke around like they didn't have a care in the world. They had no idea that their carefully constructed criminal enterprise was about to come crashing down around them. No idea that the harmless person they'd mocked and dismissed was about to become their worst nightmare. Around 4 p.m., I sent an email to Marcus requesting a meeting first thing Tuesday morning. I kept it vague, just said I needed to discuss some concerns about departmental procedures. He probably assumed I was going to complain about my workload or ask for time off, something mundane and easily dismissed. He responded within minutes, agreeing to meet at 8 a.m. Tuesday. Perfect. That gave me Monday evening to prepare, to organize my evidence, to plan exactly what I was going to say and how I was going to say it. I left the office at 5 on the dot, drove home through rush hour traffic that felt surreal given the secret I was carrying, and spent the entire evening preparing for the most important meeting of my professional life. I organized the evidence into clear categories: fraud, documentation of illegal activities, communication demonstrating intent and coordination, financial records showing the flow of stolen money. I created a presentation, ironically using the same PowerPoint skills I'd honed creating those boring spreadsheets everyone mocked me for. I practiced my delivery, trying to find the right tone, confident but not arrogant, serious but not hysterical, clear that I meant business but open to resolution. I also prepared a backup plan, multiple backup plans actually, because I knew this confrontation could go wrong in so many ways. I copied all the evidence to a cloud storage account Marcus couldn't access. I prepared an email to the company's board of directors that would automatically send if I didn't stop it by a certain time. I even drafted a message to a journalist contact I had from college, someone who worked at a business news outlet and would definitely be interested in a story about corporate fraud at a mid-sized tech company. By the time Monday evening turned into Tuesday morning, I was as ready as I'd ever be. I barely slept that night, my mind racing through scenarios and possibilities and potential outcomes. Part of me wondered if I was making a terrible mistake, if I should just look for a new job and walk away from this mess before I got sucked in deeper. But another part of me, the part that had been growing stronger since Friday afternoon, knew that walking away wasn't an option anymore. I'd seen too much, knew too much, and more than that, I'd finally found my voice, my power, and I wasn't going to give that up just because confronting corruption was scary and risky. Tuesday morning arrived with gray skies and the threat of rain, weather that matched my mood perfectly. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy suit I usually saved for important presentations, armor for the battle ahead. I arrived at the office at 7:30, half an hour before my scheduled meeting with Marcus, and used that time to center myself, to remind myself why I was doing this. Not just for revenge, though I'd be lying if I said that wasn't part of it, but for every person who'd ever been marginalized or dismissed or made to feel worthless by people who abused their power. At 7:55, I walked to Marcus's office carrying my laptop and a leather folder that contained printouts of key evidence documents. His door was open, and he was sitting at his desk scrolling through his phone, coffee in hand, looking like a man without a care in the world. I knocked on the doorframe, and he looked up, his expression shifting from distracted to politely interested when he saw it was me. "Sarah, come in," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "What can I do for you this morning?" I walked in, closed the door behind me, which made his eyebrows raise slightly, and sat down. I placed my laptop and folder on his desk, folded my hands, and looked him directly in the eye. "We need to talk about the Meridian Initiative," I said, and I watched the color drain from his face. For a long moment, he didn't say anything, just stared at me like I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. Then he recovered, smoothed his expression back into something approximating professional courtesy, and said, "I'm not sure what you're referring to. Meridian isn't something that involves your role, so I'm not sure why you'd be concerned about it." I opened my laptop, pulled up the first document, a spreadsheet showing inflated billing to one of our largest clients, and turned the screen toward him. "This is what I'm referring to," I said calmly. "The systematic fraud that you, Jennifer, David, Tom, and at least 6 other people have been perpetrating for the past 18 months. The fake vendors, the inflated expenses, the manipulated financial records, all of it." His face went from pale to flushed, and I could see the calculations happening behind his eyes as he tried to figure out how I'd gotten this information and what I planned to do with it. "Where did you get those files?" he asked, his voice tight. "Those are confidential. You had no authorization to access them." "Confidential?" I repeated, tasting the irony of the word. Yes, they're confidential because they document criminal activity. As for authorization, let's just say that your IT department isn't as careful about access permissions as they should be. But here's the thing, Marcus. How I got the files doesn't matter. What matters is what's in them, and what I'm going to do with this information. He leaned back in his chair, trying to regain some sense of control over the situation. You're making some serious accusations, Sarah. Accusations that could have serious consequences for you if you're wrong. Are you absolutely certain you understand what you're looking at? I smiled, not a friendly smile, a smile with teeth. I'm absolutely certain. I've spent the last 3 days reviewing every document, every email chain, every financial transaction. I understand exactly what I'm looking at, Marcus. You and your team have stolen approximately $3.7 million from clients over the past 18 months through systematic overbilling and fraudulent expense claims. You've created shell companies to receive payments for services never rendered. You've manipulated project timelines and deliverables to justify inflated costs. And you've covered it all up with carefully constructed documentation that would fool anyone who wasn't specifically looking for fraud. I pulled out several printed documents from my folder and laid them on his desk one by one, like I was dealing cards in a very high-stakes game. Here's the email where Jennifer expresses concerns about the ethical implications but defers to your judgment. Here's the spreadsheet showing payments to Zenith Consulting Group, a company that doesn't actually exist beyond a P.O. box and a bank account. Here's the internal memo where you discuss managing the audit trail to ensure everything looks legitimate. Should I continue, or do you get the picture? Marcus's jaw clenched, and I could see him struggling to maintain his composure. What do you want? He finally asked, the question I'd been waiting for. What do I want? I echoed, leaning forward slightly. That's an interesting question, Marcus. What I want is for you to understand that I'm not the harmless, invisible, forgettable person you and your friends have treated me like for the past 5 years. What I want is for you to realize that the person you mocked in that conference room last Friday, the person whose presentation you cut short and whose work you dismissed as a waste of time, that person is now holding your entire future in her hands. I watched the realization settle over him, watched him understand that the power dynamic between us had shifted completely and irreversibly. Here's what's going to happen, I continued, my voice steady and calm despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. You have exactly 24 hours to decide what you're going to do. Option 1, you come clean. You go to the executives who aren't involved in this scheme, you go to the board of directors, you go to the authorities, and you confess everything. You take full responsibility, you cooperate with any investigation, and you make sure that every person you've stolen from is made whole. Option 2, I take this information public myself. I go to the board, I go to the SEC, I go to the media, and I make sure that not only is your criminal activity exposed, but I also make sure everyone knows about the toxic, discriminatory workplace culture you've created, the harassment and favoritism and abuse that you've normalized in this department. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but I held up my hand to stop him. I'm not finished, I said. You need to understand something else. I'm not doing this for money or career advancement or any kind of personal gain. I'm doing this because it's right, because you and people like you need to face consequences for your actions, and because I'm done being silent and complicit in a system that protects people who abuse their power. There was a long silence in that office, so profound I could hear the clock on Marcus's desk ticking, could hear voices in the hallway outside, could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Finally, Marcus spoke, and his voice was different now, stripped of the arrogant confidence I'd always associated with him. Sarah, please, let's talk about this reasonably. You don't understand the full context. There were pressures from upstairs, expectations about revenue growth that were impossible to meet legitimately. This wasn't my idea originally. I was brought into something that was already happening. I cut him off. I don't care about your justifications or excuses. I don't care if you were under pressure or if someone else started it. You made choices, Marcus. Every single day for 18 months, you made the choice to participate in fraud, and you made the choice to create an environment where people who tried to do the right thing, people like me, were marginalized and silenced. Those were your choices, and now you get to live with the consequences. I stood up, gathering my laptop and folder. 24 hours, I repeated. If I don't hear from you by this time tomorrow with a plan for how you're going to come clean, I'm going to the board and the authorities myself. And Marcus, don't try to delete files or cover your tracks. I have copies of everything stored in multiple locations, and I've set up automated systems that will distribute the information if anything happens to prevent me from doing so manually. Do you understand? He nodded slowly, looking like a man who'd just watched his entire world crumble. I understand, he said quietly. I walked to the door, then paused and turned back. One more thing, I said. Jennifer, David, Tom, and everyone else involved in Meridian, they should probably be preparing themselves too, because when this comes out, and it will come out, everyone who participated is going down. You might want to give them a heads up, or don't. That's up to you. I walked out of Marcus's office and closed the door behind me, and the moment I was in the hallway, my legs nearly gave out from the adrenaline crash. I'd done it. I'd actually confronted him, laid out everything I knew, and given him an ultimatum. There was no going back now, no pretending this conversation hadn't happened, no returning to the status quo of being invisible and harmless. For better or worse, I'd declared war, and now I had to see it through to the end. The rest of Tuesday passed in a strange fog where everything felt both hyper-real and distant at the same time. I returned to my desk and tried to focus on actual work, but my mind kept replaying the meeting with Marcus, analyzing every word and expression, trying to predict what he would do next. I noticed Jennifer walking into Marcus's office mid-morning and staying there for almost an hour, her usual confident stride replaced with something more hurried and anxious when she emerged. Word was spreading, I realized. Marcus was warning his co-conspirators that their scheme had been discovered. Throughout the day, I caught people looking at me differently, or maybe I was just hyper-aware because I knew what I'd done. David walked past my desk and paused, like he wanted to say something, then thought better of it and kept walking. Tom avoided eye contact entirely when we passed in the hallway. Rebecca, who'd been in that Friday conference room and witnessed my humiliation but hadn't participated in the mockery, stopped by my desk around 2 p.m. and quietly asked if I was okay. I'm fine, I told her, and I realized it was true. For the first time in years, I actually felt fine, better than fine. I felt powerful and purposeful and alive, in a way I hadn't experienced since long before I started working at Richardson Tech. That evening, I went home and did something I rarely allowed myself to do. I called my mom and told her everything. Well, not quite everything. I left out some of the specific details about how I'd obtained the evidence. But I told her about the mockery in the conference room, about discovering the fraud, about confronting Marcus. I expected her to be worried, to tell me I was taking too big a risk, to encourage me to find a new job and walk away before I got hurt. But instead, she was quiet for a long moment and then said, "I'm proud of you, Sarah. You've always been so afraid of making waves, of standing up for yourself. It's good to hear you finally fighting back." Her words made me cry, releasing tension I didn't know I'd been holding. We talked for over an hour, and she helped me think through various scenarios for how the next day might unfold. She also reminded me that I needed to be prepared for the possibility that things might get uglier before they got better, that powerful people often fought back hard when threatened, and that I should document everything and protect myself as much as possible. I spent Tuesday evening creating additional backups of all the evidence, storing copies with a lawyer friend who agreed to hold them without asking too many questions, sending encrypted files to myself at multiple email addresses. I was building a fortress of information, making sure that no matter what Marcus or anyone else tried to do, the truth would come out. Wednesday morning arrived, and I was at my desk by 7:30, earlier than necessary but unable to sit at home waiting for something to happen. The office felt different, charged with an energy that I couldn't quite name but could definitely sense. People were whispering in clusters, conversations that went silent when certain people approached. I wasn't the only one who noticed something was wrong. The whole department could feel that a storm was coming. At 8:15, my phone rang. It was Marcus's extension. "Sarah, can you come to my office, please?" His voice was formal, carefully neutral. "Of course," I said, and hung up. This was it. The moment that would determine how everything else unfolded. I grabbed my laptop, more out of habit than necessity since all the evidence I needed was backed up elsewhere, and walked to Marcus's office for the second time in 2 days. When I arrived, the door was closed, which was unusual. I knocked, and Marcus called for me to come in. I opened the door and stopped short. Marcus wasn't alone. Sitting in the chairs across from his desk were Patricia Morrison, our executive vice president, and Robert Chen, the head of legal. This wasn't what I'd expected, but I kept my expression neutral and walked in. "Sarah, thank you for joining us," Patricia said, gesturing to an empty chair. "Please, sit down. We have some things we need to discuss." I sat, acutely aware that I was now outnumbered 3-1, and that this meeting could go in a lot of different directions, not all of them good for me. "Mr. Henderson has brought to our attention some concerning allegations," Patricia continued. her tone professional but with an undercurrent I couldn't quite read. Allegations about financial improprieties within his department. He's also indicated that you have information relevant to these allegations. We'd like to hear your perspective on the situation. This was the moment where everything could either validate my actions or blow up spectacularly in my face. I took a breath and made a choice to trust that Patricia and Robert weren't part of the conspiracy, that they were genuinely interested in getting to the truth. Yes, I have information, I said, meeting Patricia's eyes directly. Over the past several days, I've discovered evidence of systematic fraud being perpetrated by members of this department. The scheme, which they called the Meridian Initiative, involved overbilling clients through fake vendors and inflated expense reports over approximately 18 months. Based on the financial records I've reviewed, the total amount stolen is somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 to $4 million. Robert leaned forward. That's a serious allegation, Ms. Brennan. What evidence do you have to support this claim? I opened my laptop and pulled up a folder containing organized summaries of the key evidence. I have extensive documentation, I said. Financial spreadsheets showing the fraudulent transactions, email communications between the perpetrators discussing the scheme and how to conceal it, internal memos outlining the structure of fake companies created to receive payments, and audit trails showing how records were manipulated to hide the fraud. I turned the laptop toward them. I'd be happy to walk you through all of it, though I should mention that I've made multiple copies stored in secure locations, both as protection for myself and to ensure this information can't be suppressed or destroyed. Patricia and Robert exchanged a glance that I couldn't quite interpret. Then Patricia turned to Marcus, and her expression was cold. Mr. Henderson, I think you'd better leave while we discuss this with Ms. Brennan. Marcus started to object, then seemed to think better of it. He stood, avoiding eye contact with all of us, and walked out of his own office. The moment the door closed behind him, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Ms. Brennan, Patricia said, and her tone was different now, less formal and more human. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something. The board has been conducting a quiet investigation into financial irregularities for the past 2 months. We've had suspicions that something wasn't right, but we didn't have concrete evidence and we didn't know the full scope of what was happening. What you've just described aligns with what we've been trying to uncover. I felt a wave of relief so intense it was almost dizzying. So, you believe me? I asked. We'll need to verify everything thoroughly, Robert said. But based on your description and the fact that it matches patterns we've been seeing, yes, we're taking this very seriously. The question now is whether you're willing to cooperate fully with our investigation and provide access to all the evidence you've gathered. Absolutely, I said without hesitation. I want this exposed and I want the people responsible held accountable. For the next 3 hours, I sat in that office and walked Patricia and Robert through everything I'd found. Every document, every email, every suspicious transaction. I explained how I'd discovered the initial clues, how I'd accessed the shared drive files. I admitted to that part openly because I figured honesty was my best strategy at this point, and how I'd spent days analyzing and organizing the information. They listened intently, asked detailed questions, and took copious notes. Robert occasionally interrupted to clarify legal points or to ask about specific documentation. Patricia's expression grew darker as the full scope of the fraud became clear. When I finally finished, Patricia sat back in her chair and rubbed her temples. This is worse than we thought, she said. Not just in terms of the amount stolen, but the number of people involved and how long it's been going on. She looked at me with something that might have been respect. Ms. Brennan, what you've done took considerable courage. You could have looked the other way, or you could have just quit and let someone else deal with it. Instead, you put yourself at risk to expose serious wrongdoing. That's commendable. I did it because it was right, I said simply, and because I was tired of being treated like I didn't matter. Patricia nodded slowly. I understand there have been other issues in this department beyond the financial fraud, is that correct? I hesitated, unsure how much to share. Then I decided I'd come this far, might as well go all the way. Yes, I said. There's been a pattern of favoritism, harassment, and discrimination that's been going on for years. Marcus has created a toxic environment where a small group of favored employees get all the opportunities and recognition, while others are marginalized and dismissed. Last Friday, I was humiliated in a department meeting when trying to present work I'd spent weeks preparing. That was actually the catalyst that led me to start investigating what else might be wrong in this department. Robert was taking notes again, and Patricia's expression suggested she was not surprised by this information. We've had complaints about the culture in this department before, Patricia admitted, But they were always vague, and when HR investigated, people were too afraid to speak on record. If you're willing to provide specific details and testimony about what you've experienced and witnessed, that would help us address this problem comprehensively. I'm willing, I said. I have documentation of incidents going back several years, and I think if people know there's going to be real accountability this time, others will be willing to come forward too. The meeting wrapped up with Patricia and Robert explaining what would happen next. There would be a formal investigation, both of the fraud and of the workplace culture issues. I would need to provide all my evidence officially and be available for interviews. Marcus, Jennifer, David, Tom, and anyone else implicated would be placed on administrative leave immediately pending the investigation's outcome. The board would be briefed that afternoon, and depending on what they decided, law enforcement might be brought in. One more thing, Patricia said as I was preparing to leave. I need to ask you to keep this confidential for now, at least until we've briefed the board and started the formal process. We don't want to tip off anyone who might try to destroy evidence or otherwise obstruct the investigation. I understand, I said, though I should mention that several people in the department already know something is happening because Marcus has been acting strangely, and there's been a lot of closed-door meetings. Patricia smiled grimly. Let them worry. Sometimes anxiety is useful for getting people to make mistakes. I left Marcus's office, walked past the cubicles where my colleagues were working and pretending they weren't desperately curious about what was happening, and returned to my own desk. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. The burden of carrying this secret alone was finally lifting. I wasn't fighting this battle by myself anymore. I had powerful allies who were committed to seeing justice done. The rest of Wednesday and all of Thursday were a blur of activity. Patricia had made good on her promise. By Thursday morning, Marcus, Jennifer, David, and Tom were all on administrative leave, officially for unspecified reasons, but everyone in the department knew something major was happening. HR started conducting interviews with department members, asking questions about workplace culture and whether anyone had witnessed or experienced inappropriate behavior. I had several more meetings with Robert and his legal team, going through evidence in excruciating detail, providing statements, signing affidavits. The investigation was moving quickly, faster than I'd expected, which suggested that the preliminary evidence from the board's earlier investigation, combined with what I'd provided, gave them enough to take decisive action. Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after the conference room incident that had set everything in motion, Patricia called an all-hands meeting for our department. We gathered in the large conference room on the 3rd floor, the same room where I'd been humiliated 7 days earlier, and waited while Patricia and 2 other executives set up at the front. The energy in the room was tense. Everyone knew something significant was about to be announced, but nobody knew exactly what. Patricia started the meeting by thanking everyone for their patience during what she acknowledged had been a chaotic week. Then she dropped the bomb. Marcus Henderson had been terminated, effective immediately, for gross misconduct and violations of company policy. Jennifer Caldwell, David Chen, and Tom Bradley had also been terminated. Several other employees were under investigation and would remain on administrative leave. I want to be clear, Patricia said, her voice carrying authority. This company has zero tolerance for fraud, corruption, or abuse of power. An extensive investigation has revealed serious violations, both financial and ethical, within this department. Those responsible are being held accountable, both through internal processes and, where appropriate, through law enforcement channels. A collective gasp went through the room. Law enforcement meant criminal charges, meant this was bigger than just people losing their jobs, meant serious consequences. Patricia continued, I also want to address the workplace culture issues that have been allowed to fester in this department. We've heard from multiple employees about favoritism, harassment, and a hostile work environment. This is unacceptable, and it ends now. We're bringing in an interim department head who will be tasked with rebuilding this team based on merit, respect, and professional standards. We're also implementing mandatory training, new reporting mechanisms for concerns, and regular audits to ensure nothing like this ever happens again. She paused, looking around the room at all of us. Change is difficult, and I know this is a lot to process. But I want you to know that we value the employees who come to work every day, do their jobs with integrity, and deserve to be treated with respect. If you've felt overlooked, dismissed, or disrespected, I'm sorry. We're committed to doing better. After Patricia's announcement, the room erupted in whispered conversations. People were shocked, trying to process what they'd just heard. I saw Rebecca catch my eye from across the room, a question in her expression that I answered with the smallest nod. She smiled, understanding flickering across her face. In the days and weeks that followed, the full story emerged in pieces. The fraud investigation uncovered even more than I'd initially found, including connections to vendors and kickback schemes I hadn't been aware of. Marcus, Jennifer, David, and Tom all faced criminal charges for wire fraud and conspiracy. Several executives who'd been complicit also lost their jobs and faced legal consequences. The company reached settlements with the clients who'd been defrauded, paying back what was stolen plus penalties. The culture shift in our department was slower, but no less real. The interim department head, a woman named Michelle Rodriguez, who'd been brought in from another division, made it clear from day one that things were going to be different. She instituted transparent assignment processes, regular feedback sessions, and a zero-tolerance policy for favoritism or harassment. She also recognized that the department had lost significant institutional knowledge when Marcus and his inner circle were removed, and she started actually paying attention to people who'd been marginalized before, people like me, realizing we had skills and insights that had been ignored for too long. As for me, I won't lie and say everything became perfect overnight. There were still difficult days, still moments when I doubted my choices or worried about the consequences of what I'd done. Some people in the office looked at me differently now, some with respect, some with a kind of wary uncertainty, like they weren't sure if I was a hero or a threat. But I could live with that uncertainty, because the alternative was going back to being invisible and powerless, and I'd tasted what it felt like to stand up and fight back, and there was no way I was ever going back to who I'd been before. About 2 months after everything went down, Patricia called me to her office. I went with some trepidation, unsure what to expect, and found her sitting at her desk with a thoughtful expression. "Sarah," she said, gesturing for me to sit, "I wanted to talk to you about your future here at Richardson Tech. First, I want to personally thank you again for what you did. Without your investigation and willingness to come forward, we might never have uncovered the full extent of the problems in that department." She paused, studying me. "I also want to acknowledge that what you went through, the treatment you endured, was wrong. We failed you as a company, and I'm sorry for that." "Thank you," I said, not sure where this was going. "I've been reviewing your personnel file," Patricia continued. "Your performance reviews, your project contributions, your skills and qualifications. It's clear that you've been significantly underutilized and undervalued. Michelle has spoken highly of your recent work and your insights about department operations. So I'd like to offer you a promotion, senior analyst position with a substantial salary increase, and I'd like you to take a leadership role in rebuilding the analytical functions of the department." I sat there, stunned. A promotion, recognition, actual opportunity after years of being dismissed. I started, then stopped, overwhelmed. "I'd be honored," I finally managed. Patricia smiled. "Good, because we need people with integrity and courage in leadership positions, and you've proven you have both in abundance. There's one more thing, though. I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to speak at our next company-wide town hall about what happened. Not naming names or going into inappropriate details, but talking about the importance of speaking up when you see wrongdoing, and about having the courage to do the right thing even when it's difficult." I thought about that request, thought about standing up in front of the entire company and sharing my story. The old Sarah, the invisible, harmless Sarah, would have declined, would have preferred to fade back into the background now that the crisis had passed. But I wasn't that person anymore, and I realized I had an opportunity to maybe help other people who were in situations like I'd been in, to show them that standing up was possible, that your voice mattered even when you felt powerless. "Yes," I said, "I'll do it." The town hall happened 3 weeks later, and standing on that stage looking out at hundreds of employees, I told my story. I talked about being dismissed and humiliated, about stumbling across evidence of fraud, about making the difficult choice to investigate and expose wrongdoing despite the risks. I talked about how scary it was, how many times I doubted myself, how I'd almost walked away and looked for a new job instead of fighting. But I also talked about why I didn't walk away, because some things are bigger than individual comfort or career safety, because corruption thrives when good people stay silent, and because every single person in that room had the power to stand up for what was right. When I finished, there was a moment of silence, and then the room erupted in applause. People stood, people I'd never met from departments across the company, applauding not just for me but for the idea that integrity mattered, that courage could make a difference. I saw colleagues from my own department, people who'd witnessed my journey from invisible analyst to whistleblower to leader, and the pride and respect in their expressions was worth more than any promotion or salary increase could ever be. In the months that followed, the story of what happened at Richardson Tech became something of a legend in corporate circles, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and toxic culture, but also an inspiring story about individual courage and corporate accountability. I did interviews for business publications, spoke at conferences about corporate ethics and whistleblower protections, and became an unexpected advocate for workplace reform. But the real satisfaction came from the smaller daily changes I saw in my department and in myself. The way people spoke up in meetings now, the way concerns were addressed instead of dismissed, the way merit and integrity started to matter more than politics and favoritism. I thought back to that Friday afternoon in the conference room, to Jennifer's mocking comment and Marcus's dismissive attitude, to feeling so small and powerless and humiliated, and I realized that they'd actually done me a favor. They'd pushed me to a breaking point that became a turning point, forced me to finally see my own worth and power. Have you ever been through something similar? Have you ever reached that point where you had to decide whether to stay silent or speak up, whether to accept mistreatment or fight back? I want you to know that if you're in that situation right now, if you're feeling invisible and powerless and dismissed, you're stronger than you think, you have more power than you realize, and your voice matters more than anyone has told you. The system might seem designed to keep you quiet, to make speaking up feel impossible or too risky, but I promise you that the risk of staying silent is greater, the risk of losing yourself, of accepting a reality where wrong is allowed to flourish unchallenged, that's the bigger danger. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a toxic workplace or witnessed wrongdoing that you struggled with whether to report? Have you ever been underestimated and then surprised people with what you were capable of? Share your experiences in the comments below because these conversations matter, because hearing each other's stories helps us realize we're not alone, and because collective courage is how we change systems that seem too big to fight. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own situation, or inspired you to consider standing up for what's right, please hit that like button. It helps the algorithm share this story with others who might need to hear it. And if you want more stories about real people facing real challenges and finding the courage to overcome them, subscribe to my Truth Revealed Tales and turn on notifications, because every week we share stories that matter. Stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Stories that remind us all that we have more power than we think we do. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being part of this community. And remember that you are never as powerless as someone else wants you to believe. Your voice matters. Your courage matters. And the world needs people willing to stand up and speak truth even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult, because that's how real change happens. One brave person at a time.